So we're familiar with string variables. We know when we create a string variable, we use the string keyword to declare it. We give it a name, we use the equal sign, and we specify the string literal that we want the variable to contain. You'll have also noticed that if you compare something like a string to something like an integer variable, the name string has a capital letter at the beginning, whereas integer doesn't. And this is because integer is what's called a primitive type, whereas string is what's called a class. Okay, and being a class allows us to do certain special things with with each string. The proper terminology for describing the class, which is string, and the thing we name is that string is the class, and then in this case title is what we call an object, or we might also call it an instance of a class. So the class describes how something should be, string describes what we can do with any given sequence of characters, and then title is a specific instance of a string, and this particular one contains the text Java programming. So under the hood, Java programming is inside this particular title object. As I say, with objects we can do special things with them. Okay, we can query it, we can ask questions of it. So as a good sort of starting point, we might think, well, how could we find out how long the title is? Okay, well, you and I know we can count the value that's come here, but if this string had come from the user, that we would not necessarily know how long it's going to be. Okay, and because title is an instance of string, we can use the methods available in string to find out how long it is. So we would do that by typing the name of our variable, our object, pressing the dot, and then typing the name of what's called a method. Okay, method is a small unit of work to find out, and in this case string has a method called length, and you can see it's popping up with a lot of different methods, but we're interested in length. And what that will do is it will give me back an integer. So if I delete that again and I start typing, you'll see it says here length, and on the right hand side it's saying what type of thing am I going to get back from it. So in this case I'm getting back an integer. So in order to be able to use that, we're likely to want to store it in a variable. If I just do this, length doesn't go anywhere. Okay, it's telling me that string.length is ignored. So what I'm likely to do is say int, let's call it title length. I've just used the variable name title, and I'm going to set that to be the length of the title text, which is Java programming. So if I go and print it out, the title length, we will find out exactly how long the text Java programming is, and it will include the space because the space is a character. So let's just run that. There we go, 16 characters long. So if I, for example, change this just to be Java and run it, we'll get the expected answer of 4. Okay, so in this case we're calling the length method that belongs to string, and in particular this instance of string, this particular one, and we get back a response. We store that in a variable and we can do something with it. And what's happening is behind the scenes is a little bit of work being done to figure out how long the length of, in this case, title is. Okay, so there's quite a lot of different methods that we can use on strings, so we're going to work through a few of them now. The next one lets us find out the character at a given position in a string. Okay, so we could just start writing, title, and then so this particular one lets us find the character. It's called char at or car at, depending on how we pronounce it. This is a little bit different because with length we didn't have to provide any information in order to be able to use the method. Okay, but in this case we want to specify which character it is that we are trying to, which position we want to find the character for. And this works on a zero-based indexing system. So the first character is going to be at position 0, the second at position 1, second at position 2. First one at position 0, second at position 1, third at position 2, fourth at position 3, and so on. So if I want to find this P, which happens to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, sixth character, the index position, if we start counting 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, will be 5. Okay. Again, the char@at method returns a character, so we would store that, or char would say start a letter, and we could store that. So if I wanted to print that out, again, I could print out a letter, and we would expect that to be the letter P. So we'll run that and try it out. And there we go. So if I wanted to print out the first letter, I could change that to a 0 and run it again. And there we go, we've got the J of Java. You can only put in this is called a parameter. So we are calling a method. Chara is a method. We're calling a method and we are passing a parameter into that method. We can only pass parameters that the method can accept. So if I, for example, put in a D there as a character, in fact, actually, there's a bad example because under the hood a character is a number, but let's say we put in a string as a D, it's going to complain and it's going to say provided type int, required type int, provided string. So it can't find a character at position D because D doesn't make any sense. It can only take a number there. So there we go. Now we do have the potential here for a problem. So you might think, well, okay, we can supply an integer. So what happens if I look for the character at position 100? Okay, so we'll run our code and we'll see what happens there. Okay, so obviously there aren't 100 characters in this string. It's tried to find it and our program has crashed. It's thrown an exception. And if we have a look here, it says exception in thread main java.lang string index out of bounds exception. Okay, I'm just going to bring this up a little bit so we can see it. And it says string index out of range 100. Okay, and as we look through this list, this is called the stack trace. At the bottom, we can see where it has happened in our own code. So it's happened in our main.java file, and it's happened on line 9, which is here. Okay, so we need to be aware that just because we can try and do something doesn't mean it's going to work. In this case, if we supply any character longer than or with any number with a position higher than this particular position. So I think we decided this was it 16 characters long when we asked for the length. So if we went for anything after 15, bear in mind that we start at 0, then we're going to get an error. So we can test it. We go back to 15. I think if we've got the count right, there should be a G. There we go. That's the G of programming. If I make it 16, we'll get that exception thrown. Okay, so that's finding the character at any given position. Okay, and a potential that can go wrong there. We'll keep going. We'll find another one now. So this is, we are wanting to find out if our string ends in something. Okay, so we can do that. We can ask our string, again it's called title in this case, and there is a method called ends with, and we need to provide this method with a parameter. In this case, the parameter we supply it with is a string, okay, that represents what it is that we're looking for at the end of the at the end of the string, and it returns a Boolean value, so it will give us a true or false. Okay, so we might do something like ends with, and we might say, does it end in ing? And then we might store that in a Boolean, likely a verb. So a verb is a doing word. So if it ends in ing, it's quite likely to be a verb. And then we can say if likely verb, and we could print out the variable probably holds a verb. and then we could just add an else. The variable might not be a verb. Okay, I'm not sure, but there might be verbs that don't end in ing. Certainly there are a verb. Certainly there are nouns, obviously, definitely nouns that don't end in ing. So we can try it out. So we've got Java programming being a verb, and we've got it ends in ing, so that has become true, and this is printed out. If I change this to Java program, which is obviously a noun, and run it, we'll get the alternative output, because this will be false. Okay, so yep, that's ends with. There is a similar one for begins with. Okay, so for example, that again, if we were to let's get rid of all this. I won't do a demo, but it works in the same way. We could do title dot begins with. Oh, there isn't a begins with. Starts with. There we go. It's quite often, if you think something might exist, it's worth having a quick look and trying. I thought it was begins with. It happens to be starts with. And again, we can pass in a string for that, and we'll get a Boolean value back. Okay. Another one that we can look at is contains. So again, that's another one that returns a Boolean. Okay, and you'll see here it asks for a character sequence. What I would say is, don't worry too much about this at this stage, but a string is a character sequence, so we can use it with a string. Okay, we will talk much later in the year or in the course about what's called inheritance. But for now, you can know that a string happens to be a type of character sequence, so we can put a string in here. So does it contain Ava? Okay, and we would want to, again, this returns a Boolean value. We're not doing anything with that Boolean. Boolean contains Ava, and then we could if contains Ava, and we could print something out. Okay. Thing to bear in mind here, and again this applies with the ends with and the I can't remember if it starts with or begins with, I've already forgotten, is that it will be case sensitive. So if we were to have a capital A here, it would return false, that it doesn't contain. So it's got to be an exact match. Another thing we might want to do is to change the casing of the text that we've got. So we might want to, for example, put it all into uppercase or lowercase. Okay, so we have a method to do that. It is called to uppercase. Okay, and there's a similar one called to lowercase. Don't worry too much about this stage, but it's also possible, because what happens when you convert something to uppercase can depend on the language in which you're using. So, for example, and potentially the country's version of that language. It's also possible to supply what's called a locale as well to that, to make sure it applies it based on the correct languages or countries' method of turning things to uppercase. But for now, we'll just use a method called to uppercase. We don't need to supply parameters. There's as I say, if you look here, there's two versions of to uppercase. One doesn't require any parameters, one requires a locale, so we can use the one that doesn't require any parameters. We could say string upper title, and then, for example, we could print out that upper title. We should see Java program, put it back to programming as it was before. We should see that in capital letters. There we go. Similarly, if we wanted to change it to lowercase, it's called to lowercase, and it would probably be better to rename that lower title, or even lowercase title, but lowercase title will do, lower title will do, and this time we'll get it all in lowercase. There we go. It's important to know that it gives you back a new string. It doesn't change the title. Okay, so what we could do is, just to make that clear, we could say new string is that one, and we could also print out the original string, which was title. Okay, what have I done here? I've put an equal instead of a plus. There we go. So if we run that, we should see title should be as it was, but lower title is given back to us as a new string. There we go. So there's our lowercase one. It's a new one. The original is unchanged. Some methods do have the ability to change the thing. For example, in this case, if we talk about changing the thing that we're acting on, some methods I don't know if we have got any for string, but would be able to, for example, change the actual underlying text here. So if you've got an object, you can change the state of that object. It's possible to do it. Uppercase and lowercase doesn't do that in this particular example. Okay. So one thing we've looked at already is the contains method. We can find out where if a string contains another string, but sometimes we might want to know exactly where in a string something else is. Okay. Again, that's possible. For that, there's a method called index of. Okay, and you can pass in a string to that. You can modify where you look for a particular string, but for now we'll just look at the index of method. Just takes a single string. So let's say I'm looking for the word program. Okay, we could store that in a variable. We could say int start position of program, and then we could print that out. Okay, so again, bear in mind it's a 0 base starting 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We should see a 5 come out for program. There we go. Okay, we do need to be careful, however. I'm just going to demonstrate that it is case sensitive. I'm going to put a lowercase p. So what it should do is it shouldn't find program in here because there isn't anything that's an exact match. And we'll just see what happens. Okay, so we actually get a result of -1. In this case, it doesn't crash. It doesn't throw an exception. We just get -1, which basically means it can't find it. If we hover over, you can often see the documentation. So it tells us what this method does. It returns the index within the string of the first occurrence. So if it occurs more than once, we only get the first one. And it says the returned index is the smallest value k. So that's what we passed in, for which sorry, that's not quite right. The smallest value k for which this dot starts with. So it will basically look through the string and find the first position where, if you cut off the first letter, then the second letter, then the third, where it starts with what we're looking for. Okay, so and it tells us about the parameters. We need to provide the string that we're looking for, and it will tell us the index, and it says there, or -1 if there is no such occurrence. Okay, so it's often a good idea to read the documentation to understand how something is meant to work. In this case, if we didn't know that and you got a value of -1 back, we might not be really understanding what, or not, if we weren't expecting it, we could have undesired results. Just a couple more that are potentially helpful. We've got empty. Okay, so if we do title.empty, or is empty, sorry, it just tells us whether or not this string is empty. So that's a boolean. Obviously it returns a boolean. String is empty. That should be capital I. Is okay, and we could say if string is empty, print out the string is empty. Okay, obviously it isn't at the moment, so if I run it, nothing will be printed. Okay, but if I make this string empty, it will print out the string is empty. Okay, note this is different to blank. Okay, blank just means it might just have white space in it. So we could do boolean string is blank equals title dot is blank, and then we could say if string is blank. Whoops. The string is blank. Okay, so if we put a value in here, hello, neither should be the case. There we go. If we make it empty, it is both empty and blank. If I put a couple of spaces in it, it's no longer empty, but it's still blank. Okay, so you need to be aware of that. Okay, one final thing we can do is replace things in the string. So you can say title dot replace, and we can replace either a sequence, i.e. a string, with another string, or we can replace a character with another character. Okay, so you could use either option. So we'll do title replace. We'll probably need to give it some text to Java programming. Let's say we wanted to capitalize for some reason all the A's. We could replace a lowercase a with an uppercase A. Okay, now we need to be careful here. Okay, it's warning us that we're not using the result, so that means it won't, in this case, it won't change the existing string like we had before. It will give us back a new string. So modified string equals, and then we could print out a modified string and see how that looks. There we go, we've capitalized the A's. Similarly, we could do a little bit more than that. We could change AVA, and again, this is a string now, so we'd say we want the AVA of Java to be replaced with capital AVA, and run that. Okay, and there we go, that has had that effect. So they're some of the various methods available on string. You can try out some of the others, see what they do. Again, we haven't looked at all the different types that could come back. Some of these, you'll think, okay, integer, I know what an integer is. We know that a char sequence is similar to a string, and we can use a string where a char sequence is needed, but it doesn't necessarily work the other way around. If it returns a char sequence, we might not be able to store that in a string. But you can have a look at all the various different methods that are available, and you can read the documentation and find out what they do as well. So that's a brief introduction to strings. I hope it's been useful.